Welcome to episode 4 of our series on technology. This was tentatively going to be called Technology and the Occult, but I've instead titled it The Dark Logos because I wanted to give a broader framing for how we think about all of these issues. Man's relationship to technology is inseparable from man's relationship to knowledge, and so therefore how we view history, all of these things. So we've been talking about the origins of this thing, the dark logos, and what it is and where it goes. And inseparable from that has been a discussion about the existence of malevolent spirits, of fallen gods. The devil we see in Eden, the fall of the gods, the watchers in Antioch. And then this whole idea that in the gods of the shadows, which was the last episode, that the fallen gods are still here. They're still in the world. They don't die. And our development of technology needs to be understood in view of how we find ourselves relating spiritually to technology and, getting at the answer to the question, well, what is it and what's going on with it? And the culmination, I think, of this whole conversation, starting in Eden and going to Enoch and to Babel and through the Middle Ages, etc., is this idea of the machine. And this is not from Paul Kingsnorth. He popularized, I think, this understanding of the machine. He's drawing on Lewis Mumford's book, and we're going to talk all about that next week. I'm just so excited about this because we're gonna do 2 episodes on the machine, because the machine is really Babel. And what do we mean by Babel? Spiritually and typologically, but also historically, in the actual historical unfolding of this reality that we're experiencing now. We're going to do 2 episodes on that next week and the week after. Those will be on Substack, by the way, not here. We do 4 weeks of the series on YouTube, and then we do the last 2 episodes, 5 and 6, on Substack, which you can see in the description. Go check that out. But why am I talking about all this for next week if that's not what we're talking about today? Because we have one last ingredient before we can get to this topic of the machine. And that is this idea of Faustian man and the Faustian age, which is sort of the core spirit of who we are when we are formed by and then produce and utilize this dark logos thing that we've been talking about in our interactions with the gods. All of these elements find their culmination in this idea of the Faustian man. And that's the last element that we need to talk about today before we get into this culminating image of the machine. So what happened? The fall of the gods and the fall of man leads to Babel. And Babel is what we build as sort of this material instantiation of the dark logos. Because again, we're building up the logo. Instead of Christ the logos, the true logic and unfolding of reality, we are building up something that is the dark logos, an artificial replacement for Christ and the true logos. And that's kind of all of pagan religion. But then Christ comes and dethrones the gods, so they don't rule the world in this direct way anymore, and that's when we get Christendom. But then Christendom falls apart mysteriously, and something new is built in its place. And the question is, well, what is built in its place? We've called it secularism on this show. People call it modernity. And the main scholar that I'm going to be drawing on today, Oswald Spengler, calls it the Faustian age. And at the center, Faustian man. And I'm going to talk about that. But first, who is Faust? Who is Dr. Faustus? So Dr. Faustus is a German folklore figure. It's a famous old story. I'm not sure how far back it goes. It's popularized by people like Goethe and Marlowe. And the legend has all these kind of similar elements. So Faust is a scholar, he's a scientist, he's very educated, but he is very unhappy. All the things he's learned have made him unhappy. I think the line in Marlowe is, alas, poor fool, for all my lore, I stand no wiser than before. So he's miserable. And so, like all educated people, what does he do to solve his problems? Well, of course, he summons a demon to grant him knowledge and magic powers. And that's how he's going to make himself happy. He's going to understand the world better because he's going to get secret knowledge from this summoned demon. And then he's going to use that knowledge for power, and he's going to use that power to indulge in pleasures. So he's going to make, so we're going to see more of this, the connection between knowledge and power, which we've talked a lot about, and then the connection between, therefore, knowledge and power to gain pleasure and just have material satisfaction. So you may know Mephistopheles is the demon that he summons, not actually the devil, I think. It depends on which version of the story, but Mephistopheles is sort of hell's representative. And so he gets summoned by Faust, and he says, yeah, I'll grant you all these things. Classic deal with the devil situation. And he's going to serve Faust for a certain number of years or for however long under different conditions, depending on the version of the story. And then at the end of it, the bargain is that the Faust will give his soul to the demon and Faust will be damned. So sell your soul to the devil for all of these things. Now, again, there's a lot of different versions of the story, and they have different endings. The earlier versions tend to always be tragedies, where Faust does this horrible thing, and it's a tragedy, and it's all about the downfall of man, and then he goes to hell. And of course, understood in a kind of Western, later understanding of hell. Later versions, especially Goethe's, end with his redemption, and that's very interesting. Goethe is sort of doing a variant on it, where it starts as a tragic story and then it ends in this kind of Christian reversal. Yada yada. Why are we talking about Faust, and why does Spengler talk about our age as the Faustian age, and that modern man is essentially Faustian man? What is the issue with this? Why? So let's examine the themes. So obviously, knowledge is power, and then you use that power to make yourself happy. But part of the theme, especially in the tragic versions of Faust, and I think I would argue in Goethe's and Marlowe's as well, is that knowledge can't actually bring you happiness or fulfillment, and pleasure can't actually do these things for you. You can't be satisfied by understanding the world and then bending it to your will. We've talked a lot about this. Another weird thing is that the solution to gaining more knowledge and power is specifically to summon a demon, a magical power. You need demonic knowledge. This is the same kind of theme as what's going on in something like Enoch or in Eden, or in Prometheus. A spirit gives forbidden knowledge, or knowledge that we would not normally have the ability to access. A spirit gives this to humans. So you see this even in a sort of modern, quote unquote, folklore story, like with Goethe. So and also don't brush over this part, which is that the idea is that, why do you need this demonic knowledge? Is it just because demons know more? They went to more school than we did? No, it's because as elemental powers, they're sort of part of the makeup of the universe. And we talked about this last week or the week before, where in Greek the word element, stoichion, came to be synonymous with a demon, because they're elemental parts of the universe. And that means that they have a deep connection to the fundamental workings of how the universe functions, because they have a different nature than us. So summoning or binding them or getting them to tell you stuff or getting them to do stuff for you means that you get this kind of access to a more fundamental, elemental way of controlling the world, having access to manipulating and exploiting nature. And of course, use these powers to pursue pleasure. And in the Faust story, almost I think every version of the story, it's centered around this romantic quest for this woman. I think her name is Gretchen in Goethe's version. And this romantic quest of Faust for her, it ruins her life, basically. So misery spreads because of this. It's pursuing pleasure leads to misery and doom for everybody involved. And then, again, the knowledge is power thing. See the relationship between magic and science, which is very blurred at this period in history. You have this idea that these are distinctive things, and you have different senses and how they might be distinctive, but, and we're going to come back to that. But I just want you to notice the top level themes here about how something you do with educated scientific knowledge is you have the ability to summon a demon and some kind of an elemental spirit. And which is the same impulse as wanting to figure out the most fundamental laws of the universe so that you know how to manipulate matter. Do you see how these two things are similar? Well, I mean, C.S. Lewis, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but C.S. Lewis is going to argue that they're basically the same. Okay, so that's the picture of Faustian man. Knowledge, power, which you get from this interaction with a fallen spirit, and you use it to pursue pleasure, and ultimately it leads to doom. That's the image that you should have in your mind about Dr. Faustus. So, see, there's some hubbub in chat. Welcome, everyone. Hello. I think we have somebody spamming us, but that's okay. We're still here. All right, so Dr. Faustus. So why does Oswald Spengler call this the Faustian age? Well, first of all, who is Spengler? Spengler, he's probably most famous for writing this book, The Decline of the West. And he wrote this, I think it was published in 1918. And it's this grand 1,000-page, 2-volume text about his thesis that the West is in its period of decline. Many people in the 20th century came to this conclusion, but Spengler does it pretty early, before the Second World War. And he predicts all these things that are going to happen to one degree or another. And in order to demonstrate and prove his thesis that the West is in a state of decline, and to predict the things that are going to happen pretty accurately, I would argue, is he has to come up with a way of viewing history. And that's a lot of what we do here on The Roots of Everything, right? We have imaginative framework. How are we viewing these historical ages? Because you can't just define them. Yeah, I know they're defined this way. People say the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. These names are all biases, by the way. They're biased from a myth of progress technological perspective, which is focusing on what? The development and use of technologies over time. Oh, this is the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age, and then the Industrial Age. It's like that's a machine's bias about what's important about history. So, and I've talked about here, so ancient, medieval, and modern, I say I want to contextualize these things in terms of the worldviews of each period, and so does Spengler. But Spengler gives different ages. So he talks about how there's 3 ages: Apollonian, what he calls them, Apollonian, Magian, and Faustian. I'll say briefly what these are because this is not a Spengler episode, much though I want it to be. He's got a lot going on with him. We're going to actually come back to Spengler in the science series, which I think is the next one after the next one. So Apollonian, Magian, Faustian. What are these periods? The Apollonian period is his name for the classical era, the Greco-Roman world. And it's pretty much the same that you would imagine. Apollonian is just for Apollos. That's pretty normal. He has things to say about it, but it's basically the classical age as you know and love it. Now, the difference is that instead of medieval and modern, he has Magian and Faustian. So that's the difference I want to focus on. Why does he have these differences? So for him, the Magian age is something like Christendom, Byzantium, and the sort of related philosophies that emerge from late antiquity through the early Middle Ages. So you might put the Magian age from like 1 AD or whatever, maybe a little later as Christianity develops, up until 1000 AD. I'm just going to, obviously Spengler, he goes into more depth. I'm going to summarize and generalize a little bit as we do. So what's going on in the Magian age? Well, he identifies, and I thought this was so interesting, the Magian age for him is, he talks about Judaism, so rabbinic Judaism, Islam, early Islam, not later Islam, and Byzantium, which I think is really interesting. What do these three things have in common? Well, in the early forms of Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, and especially Islam, there's a lot more mystic esotericism going on. There's an interest in sacred geometry and Kabbalah mysticism, and this is the great age of Islamic scholars when they were dedicated to doing philosophy with the best of them, and reading Aristotle and the boys, all these guys, Plato and so forth. And they're doing math, they're doing geometry, they're creating all this stuff. And there's this interest in understanding the world, but for Spengler, and especially when you add the Byzantine element, the similarity is that there's this kind of awe and reverence for the spiritual. There's a mystical quality to it that can't be understood. There's an emphasis on mystery and participation. And for Spengler, the symbol of this is the cave. And the symbol for him for the Apollonian period is the pillar, the Greco-Roman column, which you all know. Why the cave for the Magian era? Because the cave, like the cell of the hermit, the desert monastic, you go into it and you pray and you meditate and you have a mystical vision of things. So it's not a rationalist. It's not a rationalist pursuit. Magian, I think he's naming it for the Magi. And the Magi obviously are pagans. They're Persian. I think they're Persians, fire priests. And they read the stars, and then what do they do? They show up, and they are some of the first people to acknowledge the true God, and then they worship him and give him gifts. So there's this sense of participation and mystery and acknowledgement and a direct interaction with the divine, and therefore some humility that I think you could say is common to all three of these things. And then what's interesting to me, what's the Faustian age? Why does he cut it off at 1000 AD? Well, for him, the Faustian age is the beginning of modernity, sort of, the way we would talk about it. And most scholars talk, and me too, if you listen to the show, I tend to start modernity with 1500, with the Reformation. And we've talked a lot about how the Reformation kind of leads to the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment leads to secularism, to liberalism, and so forth. That's kind of what modernity is. It gets its start in the Reformation. Well, Spengler says what precedes the Reformation is scholasticism. So that's why he's putting it at 1000 AD, because in the late Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, whatever you want to call it, the scholastic era, you start to get 1100, 1200, 1300, 1400. What's going on here? This increasing buildup of scholasticism. And why does he identify all of these things as part of the same spirit, the scholastic spirit, then the Reformation spirit, then the Enlightenment, and so forth? It's because they're all Faustian. And what's the Faustian formula? Use knowledge to figure out the whole world so that you can conquer nature. So that way man can then rule the earth and then pursue pleasures. So now, pursuit of pleasure, obviously, to be fair, is not on the scholastics' radar. The guys who are doing all this stuff are monks. They're Catholic monks doing asceticism. They're not thinking of the world in terms of hedonism. That would come centuries later. But they are interested in this weird project, which is the university project, a project of synthesizing all knowledge and figuring out all of the fundamental core rational, mathematical, and logical causes of everything. And this is something that you're not taught in history because you got an Enlightenment curriculum, and the Enlightenment people are like, yeah, see, the Dark Ages were full of idiots and superstitious, faith-based, and they don't care about evidence, they hate thinking, they burned the witches, blah, 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 which, by the way, witchcraft, all this kind of stuff, witch hunts, that's all early modern. That's not medieval at all. C.S. Lewis even says this. I'll get to it. So the project, in other words, the project of using reason to map out the entirety of reality, you're like, oh, that sounds like the Enlightenment guys and the scientific revolution and all that stuff. Great. Yes, I agree. But that's not where it started. This is part of the dumb myth of progress revisionism. It started in the Middle Ages, in the high Middle Ages, and that's essentially what scholasticism is. Scholasticism is the attempt to map out all of reality comprehensively through logic, through reasoning, through math. And it's sort of the beginning of an interest in what you might call practical science, what would later turn into empiricism. So the scholasticism thing, the famous system builders of the Catholic thinkers in this era, they do all the system building, which lays the ground for the Enlightenment. And then, of course, the Reformation lays the ground for the radical individual. So you got system building, totalizing, universalist kind of system building. Universalist in the sense not of universal salvation, but in the sense of we can create a universal rational model for all of reality. Unified field theory, you might put it that way. This is what the medievals were interested in. So the hyper-rationalism, then the Reformation, hyper-individualism, and then the Enlightenment, which is all about individuals using their rationality to conquer the world. They become deists, which is a hop, skip, and a jump to secularism and then to liberalism. And then Spengler says that after liberalism is socialism. There's more to his theory of history there, but without getting in the weeds on it, you see the progression here, which is from the rationalism of the scholastic movement to the individualism of the Reformation. And on those two ingredients, boom, you have Enlightenment, and then the rest of it secularizes over the course of time, as we talked about in the secular series, gives rise to the secular nation state, which is what we talked about in the secular state series. And so my hope is that you're able to kind of zoom out and look at all these things and say, oh, I see what Spengler means. These all go together in the sense that they're all Faustian. So what do you get when you try to map out the universe and as an individual with reason as your mode? I'm going to be rationalist. That's the primary thing we're going to do. It leads to, very quickly, a mechanistic view of reality, and therefore a utopian view of society and history. And therefore, and this part is maybe not obvious, amorality. Not a singular morality, but amorality, like immoral, but amoral. So amoral means no morality in particular. And we've talked about this a lot, where secularism says, oh, no, we don't have a claim about the absolute moral value of anything. We just want to use utilitarian ethics or rationalist hedonism or something where we can just apply a reason to it. And any of the supernatural beliefs you have, those are, of course, you're allowed to believe it, but they're matters of personal opinion. They're not rational things that we can prove in a lab, or what the monastics, the scholastic monastics would want is to prove it with a syllogism or some kind of mathematical formula. And so when you get to this secular part, where we've removed all of the theology, but you still have the radical individualism from the Enlightenment and the radical emphasis on reason in this kind of instrumental sense, you might call it logocentric, that's one way scholars have talked about it, then you have this world that has an individual and who's using reason as his tool. But if you deny the moral order of reality and you make that subjective personal opinion, what do you have left? You just kind of have an individual with his will. What do I want? And this is sort of why this leads to hedonism, which is a life where you're just devoted to the pursuit of pleasure as the highest thing. It's from the Latin, or no, it's Greek, hedon, which means pleasure. So, and actually, side note, funny story, utilitarianism was this philosophy that the Enlightenment guys came up with as their rationalist ethics. And they said, well, we can't say anything about whether or not God exists or whether or not we know anything about the moral nature of reality. But what we can do, this is very modern, is make a calculation system where we calculate the results of things. So does this action or deed or law produce pleasure or pain? And they call them hedons and dolars. And the hedons for units of pleasure and dolars for units of pain. So they would say, okay, well, this act produces this many hedons and this many dolars. So the net effect is this many hedons. So it produces a better society because more pleasure and happiness and less pain. And so the idea was that you could reduce all of human interaction and societal elements such as laws, especially cultural norms, whatever, or individualist actions, to a calculation of how many hedons and dolars it produced. And you can see the mechanistic view of reality here. And what's so outrageous to me is that they would take this kind of calculus and then turn it into the substitute for morality. So what's good and what's evil is going to be reducible to the units of pain it produces and the units of pleasure it produces. Isn't that nuts? So, and that was the grand Enlightenment conception of how do we have a morality for society that everyone can share, where all you need is reason. You don't need revelation. You don't need a particular religious affiliation. We're just going to transcend this. And on previous episodes, when we talked about the secular states, especially liberalism, I got a little bit of pushback where some people were saying, look, you're equating liberalism with hedonism. Just because people are liberal or libertarian or conservative or whatever form of the liberal democracy that you ascribe to, that doesn't necessarily mean hedonism, which is, again, a life that's lived in pursuit of pleasure as the highest ideal. And to that I say, on paper, no. That's not what people will tell you. But functionally, yes, people ultimately live this way, where pleasure and their own self-satisfaction and their own happiness are the highest thing. That's why people do all these things that are morally awful. And then they say, well, they divorce their spouse and say, well, I'm not in love anymore. And meaning your own personal feelings are higher than the good of marriage or what's good for your children or society or whatever. It's like, if I said to you, don't get divorced, it's bad for society, a modern person would be like, well, what does that have to do with anything? I want to do this. I don't care what society, blah, blah, blah. Like, that has no hold over us. And the reason is because we're functional hedonists, because of this type of rationalist ethics. And then you say, you're overstating this, Zach. And I say, well, let's go back and look at the fathers of utilitarianism. What do they talk about? They talk about hedons and dolars and calculating morality in terms of pleasure and pain. Utilitarianism was a huge movement in the Enlightenment. It was their offering to replace Christianity, Christian moral framework. So anyway, it's all a little bit nuts. I think, is it time for a break? Well, let me just make my point real quick. I'll give you a couple quotes. So what's going on with the fathers of science? Because the claim I'm making is that they are Faustian, the scientific revolution, and all this stuff, because they want to use reason to conquer the world and to dominate it, which is not what the people in the Magian age wanted to do, according to Spengler. The early rabbinic Jews and early Islamic thinkers and Byzantium, which he just says all of Byzantium, in other words, Eastern Orthodox, their interest is in having a certain kind of mystical relationship to the divine, not a conquering relationship toward all of matter and creation. So, okay, do we see this kind of mechanistic impulse to exploit nature as part of the program, the clear intention, explicitly, in the fathers of modern science? Let's look at some of them. So I have two quotes for you here from Francis Bacon and Louis Pasteur, for which pasteurization is named. You know them. They are big shots in the history of science. Francis Bacon said that the aim of science is, quote, to let the human race recover that right over nature which belongs to it by divine bequest. So we have this divine right to rule over nature. And you're like, well, that's not quite there. Well, what does Louis Pasteur say? He says, laboratories are sacred institutions, temples of wealth and of the future. There it is that humanity grows, becomes stronger and better. So you're like, is he just being poetic? Well, why is it? I think it's very significant. Let me put it this way. It's very significant to me that the religious language that was formally applied to these elements of Christendom, like temples, gets transferred to something like a laboratory. Louis Pasteur, one of the founders of modern science. Laboratories are sacred institutions, temples. Okay, so they're not. Western man is not a secular materialist as much as he claims. Secular materialism, and I think, again, we're going to have to devote a whole series to this. Secular materialism, the scientific revolution, all these things, they're a new type of religion. It's all a new type of religion because it was made by people who were formed by Christendom. Christians made this the scientific revolution, and their Christianity shows in all of it. And what do I mean by that? Not their doctrinal Christianity, because they come up with all kinds of nonsense that is heretical by any normal standards, but their imaginative framework, which is that there is this sacred absolute order to reality, and that man must have his place as the ruler of it, which is a distortion, you may notice, going back to Eden, of Adam being placed in the garden to rule over and steward it and to cultivate it. But cultivation is different than domination. I'm going to give you a requote here. We quoted this before, but it's so good we have to keep picking on Descartes. He says, "I perceived it to be possible to arrive at knowledge highly useful in life, to discover a practical method by means of which, knowing the force and action of fire, water, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us," in other words, understanding the deep natures of reality of the elemental forces, notice the elemental forces, he continues, "we might also apply them in the same way to all the uses to which they are adapted, and thus render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature." René Descartes, ladies and gentlemen, inventor of the Cartesian graph, of much of modern mathematics, and supposedly a French Catholic, very interested in this Faustian dream of world domination. I will now give you a quote to just drive this point home, and then we're going to go to break and talk about magic. This is from Philip Sherrard. He wrote a book called The Rape of Man and Nature. And that's all I have to say if you want to know what his thesis is. So here's a quote from him. He says, "The mechanistic nature of modern science is marked by a desire to dominate, to master and possess and exploit nature, not to transform it or to hallow it," meaning to make it sacred. "In this, it simply reflects the self-assertion of its agent, the disinherited reason, which, having completed its revolt against what surpasses it, now seeks to impose its laws over the rest of life." What does that part mean? He's talking about this idea of disinterested, or what we would say disembodied reason. Again, the same project from the scholastic era of using reason unaided by quote-unquote revelation or quote-unquote faith to just understand and then dominate reality. And the reason I gave you this quote is because Sherrard contrasts transforming nature or hallowing it, which is the whole call of Adam in cultivating the garden. It's a sacred task to form it, to do sub-creation to it or co-creation. We're going to talk about this when we get to Tolkien after the break. Yes, we're talking about Tolkien. So cultivate, transform, hallow, or master, possess, exploit. This is why the Descartes quote gives me shivers, because he says lords and possessors of nature. We're going to possess it. We're not going to merely cultivate it. So that's what's going on with the founders of modern science and math. And we will be doing a 6-part series on this exact topic. What is going on with the scientific revolution? Is science neutral? What is the relationship of science, the scientific revolution, and the scientific community of that time with the religious communities of that time? What's going on with that? As I was prepping all of these, I was like, this is too interesting. We're doing a whole series on it. So we're going to come back to that. But for now, we're going to go to break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about magic and the relationship of magic to technology to wrap up our Faustian idea. So I will see you in just a few minutes. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them. To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism. a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
Welcome back. This is a good opportunity to tell you to press the like button because this helps us. This helps this goofy algorithm. See, this is the stupid irony of this whole thing. We're doing a series on technology is bad and Faustian, and then here we are on the internet trying to appease the algorithm gods. Horrible. Horrible. Anyway, I don't know how to feel about any of this. Or I do, but I'm not going to tell you until the next episode. So great comments, by the way, in the live chat. Somebody's talking about the Values books, this Children's Book of Imagination by Charles Dickens, propagandizes the knowledge that knowledge can make you happy and enable to hear your inner voice and guide you. That seems suspicious on the grounds that we've been talking about. Yes, written in the 1970s. Really interesting. I am definitely going to look into that. You can see, the poster continues, in that vein, you can see the evolution of children's book from scholastic to pure hedonism, in the sense that they are now only for laughs. I believe that. Somebody's asking me about Seraphim Rose. Is he the main source of your inspiration, or do you have other authors that shaped your thinking? I have Seraphim Rose's Nihilism, and I've started it a few times, and I just kind of never finished it. But there's a lot of books, and for no reason of no failing of his or his writing is very interesting, but there's a lot of books, as you may know, and that's kind of in and out of my list to finish. I like what he says, but I mean, I'm not heavily inspired by Seraphim Rose. I'm actually pretty underread on him, which I should probably fix at some point. People keep telling me you're talking a lot of the stuff that Seraphim Rose talked about. My main source of inspiration for all of this probably is the fact that I was a enlightenmentist, logical positivist, whatever, as a teenager. I read Descartes at 14, and it like ruined my life for the next 8 years. This is a story I don't tell that often. I could tell it sometime, but you know. And then I was just like on this quest for certainty and knowledge, and one of my classics professors accused me of being a logical positivist in college, and I was offended. And then I was like, oh no, it's true. So I just read all these things. Then I read Descartes, I read all the modern philosophers, I read Kant, and I was just like trying to make it work, and none of it worked. And so I feel like I have, well, the bad way to say it is I have a grudge because they failed me. But I mean, the more charitable reading is that I tried to make this enlightenment thing work, and it doesn't work. And I really know from the inside, from personal experience, trying to do the logical, universalist, mechanistic thing, and it falls completely apart. And I was so refreshed to read people like Hans-Georg Gadamer and Charles Taylor, who's the one that, you know, probably the one who most popularized this idea of enchanted and disenchanted thinking that everyone's talking about now. But I read Charles Taylor back in grad school, and I was just completely blown away by his thesis, and it got me to see the world differently. And now here I am. Throwing all of my old stuff in the trash. No, I still have my Descartes book with all my notes in it. Yes, I have Father Strickland's series behind me here. Good series. Also not done with it. I'm almost done. So, we are, let's see, Faustian Age, aka the White Age. That's interesting. I probably could do a whole episode on that, actually. For briefly, I will say this. I mean, I just think that these things are constructs. White is a construct. It's clearly a construct because I'm Italian American, and it's in my cultural memory from the 20th century that we are not white, and neither are the Irish, because because my family's from New York, the Irish and the Italians and the Jews were not considered white in the 20th century. They were second-class citizens. To who? To the Anglo, to the WASP. Why? Because the WASP, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, is a specific thing. And you'll notice that Italians, Irish, and Jews are not Protestant. They're not Anglo-Saxons either. But you get the idea, is that the whiteness is this kind of cultural construct that's changed way too much for me to give it a whole lot of weight. But I think what people mean by that is that it's European man specifically who does the Faustian thing and then goes and tries to conquer the whole world. That's true. That is true. But why did he do this? Well, the argument is that the Faustian age came into being because of Christianity, which is what I've been saying, which is that secularism and modernity are Christian heresies. So you have Christendom, and then it becomes Faustian, if you want to put it that way. And then we do the Age of Exploration and the World Wars and the horrors of the 20th century and all of that stuff. So in that sense, yeah, it starts with Europe for sure, and then America. But again, I have too much cultural memory of like being a non-white white in my family to endorse much ado about the construct of whiteness. So I'll come back to more chat later. So because we gotta get to this delicious magic bit. So what does all this have to do with magic? Magic. What is magic? And if you play too many video games and read Harry Potter and all this stuff, then you have all these confused categories about it. But historically, in the West, in the modern era, magic has a specific meaning. So I will start with a quote from Paul Kingsnorth to ease you into the Lewis and Tolkien stuff. So Paul Kingsnorth, you may know, he's probably the biggest Orthodox Substack on Substack. He says the following. In the early modern period, today's distinction between science, meaning real, good, objective, and magic, meaning fantastical, bad, superstitious, did not really exist. Both were branches of the same effort to understand the mysterious forces of the universe and ultimately to control them. Let me unpack that briefly. So we today, you listening to this, me, we have this impulse that science is good, it's real, it's objective, and that magic is kind of fantastical, bad, superstitious, blah, blah, blah. That's sort of ingrained in our minds. But in the ancient world, this distinction did not exist. In the medieval world, maybe, and in early modernity, it kind of didn't exist either, because they both had the same aim, which was to understand the mysterious forces of the universe in order to do what? To control them. So then Paul Kingsnorth continues, and he gives two definitions here. So he gives you first Francis Bacon's definition of science, which is the following: the knowledge of causes and secret motions of things, and the enlarging of human empire to the effecting of all things possible. Let me repeat that. The knowledge of causes and secret motions of things, so understanding the true nature of the universe, and the enlarging of human empire, so you have knowledge, and that it enlarges the power and the empire dominion of man, to the effecting of all things possible. Total domination of reality. We will now compare this. So this is all still part of his quote. He compares this to the following. He says, and here is the occultist Aleister Crowley's definition of magic. So Aleister Crowley, who you may know, is the originator, popularizer of basically what we would call Wicca now. He called it Thelema, I believe. His definition of magic is this: the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with the will. And Paul Kingsnorth goes on to say, these could be swapped around without anybody really noticing. The thread that links them together is control. So, and Crowley says science in his quote, does science and art of causing change, so controlling the world, in conformity with the will. The will, because again, there's no moral universe, there's no absolute moral order to the universe that's outside of our own, let's say, subjective opinion about the moral order of reality. You believe in Zeus, I believe in Thor, this guy believes in Yahweh, whatever. That's an atheist perspective. Okay, those are all your personal opinions. There isn't. So what's the shared common moral order that we can all believe in as a culture? And you have this definition of science and this definition of magic, which is basically about knowledge leading to power, and that power being used for the control of reality in conformity to the will, not to the good. That's what Plato would say. That's what Aristotle would say. That's what Cicero would say. That's what all the great pagan thinkers would have said. The good. That's, again, so side note. This is why I don't sign off on... I'm a little uncomfortable saying neo-paganism for what's going on, because the pagans would have just found this incredibly impious, that we're going to dominate reality in accordance with the will and ignore the question of the good. The pagans would have been, the ones that I just listed, would have been horrified by this idea. It's deeply impious. So what's going on with this? A Christian heresy. That's what. That's been my argument. Okay. So then C.S. Lewis says basically the same thing in his book, The Abolition of Man, which is a great essay. If you haven't read it, recommend. He says, quote, the fact that the scientist has succeeded where the magician failed has put such a wide contrast between them in popular thought that the real story of the birth of science is misunderstood. You will even find people who write about the 16th century as if magic were a medieval survival, meaning something that survived from the Middle Ages, and science the new thing that came in to sweep it away. Those who have studied the period know better. There was very little magic in the Middle Ages. The 16th and 17th centuries are the high noon of magic, meaning that's when magic was going nuts. The serious magical endeavor and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. One was sickly and died, the other strong and it throve, meaning it thrived. But they were twins. They were born of the same impulse. This is exactly what Paul Kingsnorth is talking about. So back to Paul Kingsnorth. He says, both the scientific enterprise and the magical quest for which it was a part of spring from the same desire, to know the world and to bend it to our will. Will, in both cases, is the key word. When Aleister Crowley, pioneering occultist, rampant self-publicist, and self-described great beast, created his own religion, Thelema, in the early 20th century, he gave it its own famous commandment. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. So in other words, so now I'm talking, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. This was Crowley, the great occultist. This was his maxim, like the golden rule for Thelema, which I believe carries into Wicca pretty directly. Check me on that, but I think there's something like that in Wicca. And back to Paul Kingsnorth, he says, Thelma wilted on the vine. But we could say that Crowley's dictum lived on as the foundational basis for what our culture has become. True. True. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law? Are you insane? Obviously, I hear the saints. I was going to say the saints turning over in their graves. I can hear the saints secreting myrrh in their graves. But I can hear the pagans turning over in their graves, too. So that's is madness, actually, from any reasonable ancient standard. So now we get to Tolkien. So why am I talking about Tolkien? Because I love Tolkien. I'm sure you do, too. But why? People are always like, is Tolkien good because he created all these languages and worlds? No. I mean, yes, but people do that now. That's like everything. Brandon Sanderson, etc. What's unique and powerful about Tolkien is his moral vision for reality and the way that these quote-unquote magic systems they're not really magic systems. They're rooted in the moral nature of reality. So here's the Tolkien quote. He says, "The elves are there in my tales to demonstrate the difference." Well, let me back up a second. So he associates magic and machinery in his work. So you'll notice this a lot with Sauron. There's sorcery, and then there's machines. The machines are always coming in and doing all these things. And Sauron uses machines. And so Tolkien identifies that the desire for power is what leads to the machines, or to magic. And he identifies the impulse to do these things with domination and coercion. And he contrasts this to what the elves do with this term magic. Because he says in his letters that he's sort of ambiguous when he uses the term magic in the text, because different people are from different perspectives calling things magic. And he says the magic that Sauron does is the machine, domination, coercion. What the elves do is different. So here's the quote. He says, "But the elves are there in my tales to demonstrate the difference. Their quote-unquote magic is art, capital A, art, delivered from many of its human limitations. More effortless, more quick, more complete," because the elves are just the firstborn. They're better than humans at everything. "And its object is art, not power, subcreation, not domination, and tyrannous reforming of creation." So the aim of elvish magic is art and not power. Subcreation, meaning continuing to create the world and work with God, subcreate. Well, God's the creator, we're the subcreators, we're participating in the divine act of creation, rather than the tyrannous reforming of creation, which is domination. And then he continues and says, "The enemy is, in successive forms, is always naturally concerned with sheer domination, and so becomes the lord of magic and machines." Magic and machines. Domination, coercion, tyrannous reforming of creation, rather than harmonious subcreating. You see the difference? Because the goal of the one is power, so the exertion of the will, and the goal of the other is art, beauty, making creation unfold more of its glorious depths. This is central to Tolkien's moral framing for the magical kind of cosmological forces that are going on in his texts. And you see this happen at the end of the book with the Scourging of the Shire. What happens? They come and they ruin the Shire. They pull up all the agriculture and they put in industry. They put in industrialism. This is what happens to Orthanc as well. When Saruman falls, he goes from a good wizard who's surrounded by trees, and then what's the first thing he does? He pulls up all the trees and he burns them all to fuel his war machine. And that's when the Ents have to come and take him out, and that's the revenge of nature against the domination of iron and steel. This is also why fairies hate iron in all these mythologies, because the machine it rapes nature and ruins it, and it's tyrannous. That's what Tolkien says. So, excuse me, what is going on with all of this? What conclusions can we draw here? This is the Dark Logos at work. We take the knowledge, the demonic knowledge, we use it to extend the will, to dominate the earth, and to reshape it, and to reshape ourselves. That's what's going on with transhumanism. We're going to have a whole episode on transhumanism in the next series. And it begins in Genesis with Babel, sort of, and it ends with Babel, and you could argue that it's always Babel. We're always making Babel. What is Babel? Babel is the instantiation of the Dark Logos. It's what we do as fallen man. Because remember, the gods and man fall together. Faust summons a demon. We're always summoning the demon. And then what do we do with the demon? We say, let's build Babel. Because that's our common aim. Because why did the gods fall? Because of appetite. In Enoch, they lust after sex with women. Why does man fall? He lusts after power and control. He wants to be his own God. There's appetite, the vices, the passions. These are the things that lead to the fall. So, of course, after we fall because of these things, we build an artificial logos, not Christ, who is morality itself. We build the dark logos, which is just a means to dominate the earth, to suck everything up out of it in conformity to our will. And this is what Tolkien calls the machine. The Machine, title case. So does Lewis Mumford, who is an influence on Paul King's North. Lewis Mumford wrote a 2-volume series about the machine, which we're going to explore in depth next week and the following week. Again, these are going to be on Substack. So next week, same time, 1 p.m., go to the Substack, zacharyporcu.substack.com, and we're going to have these 2 bonus episodes for the next 2 weeks. The next 2 weeks, there's not going to be anything on YouTube. It's going to be on Substack. And for episode 5 and 6, we're going to completely talk about the machine. Next week's episode is called Babel Reborn, because it's my thesis, and all these other people that I'm borrowing from, is that we always create Babel. That is what we do. And Babel is what? The machine. And the pyramids, this is a preview. Lewis Mumford says, modern technocratic society is clearly the machine, but so are the pyramids. Actually, that was another type of machine society. And what are the pyramids? They're these great, big, tall pillars raising up to the sky. They're a type of Tower of Babel. It's all related because it's this all-dominating power that seeks to envelop all of reality. So right now, we are building a machine all around us. That should be clear. But what's going to be cool about next week's episode is we're going to talk about how this machine pattern recurs all throughout history, actually, just in different forms that you may not be aware of immediately because of the historical bias, because of the myth of progress. So the pyramids were made of stone. You're like, well, where's the machine part? Well, the machine part is spiritual. It's the dark logos. You're going to see. It's going to be very cool. And then the week after that is, I think I'm going to call that episode You Are the Machine, because we're actually going to tie together everything from the Secular Nation State series and talk about how every part of it, liberalism, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, left, right, government, bureaucracy, corporations, fascism, communism, all of these things, ancient Egypt, they are all building the machine. All of them. Even the science fiction stories that warn against the machine get monetized by the machine. You will see. It's gonna be pretty cool. Again, zacharyporcu.substack.com. Links in the description. All that stuff. Do the YouTube things. Like, subscribe, whatever. You're probably already subscribed because you're here. All right, let's take a look at chat. What is happening with chat? The Faustian did not come from Christianity alone. Ethiopia is Christian and not Faustian. It's Christianity plus European genetics. I don't know about European genetics. I think what you're saying is similar to what Spengler says, because it's not just Christianity, blanketly, because Spengler distinguishes between Byzantium and scholasticism. And obviously those are two forms of Christianity, but they're very different. They're very different. And for Spengler, that's the whole difference. That's all the difference in the world. Because the Byzantium, in other words, the Eastern Orthodox world, its fundamental impulse, its relation to power and knowledge, is what he calls Magian, which is more about mystery and conformity to that mystery, rather than this desire to conquer all of the universe. So that desire gets formed, he argues, in scholasticism in the West. So if that's what you mean by European genetics, then I don't know about genetics, but I mean, that's the cultural heritage of Western Europe, is this kind of scholastic, universalizing, totalizing sense of what we need to do. Christianity is the problem since it gave birth to the Faustian age? No. A type of Christianity. That's what I'm being clear about here. And this is in Spengler. This is in John Strickland's series. He makes the same identification because the age, well, my books are not in order here, but it's the age of paradise leads to the age of division, and the age of division leads to this utopian era, right? So it's not Christianity, all of it, because Byzantium, half of Christianity, didn't go that way, just at all. Orthodoxy never had these problems. It's a particular kind of Christianity that's rooted in what's going on with scholasticism. And honestly, because of that distinction, I'm really interested in doing a whole 6-part series on just Western Christianity, because I don't think we make these distinctions a lot in the West, because obviously we're Westerners. So we just think Christianity is this, it's this particular thing. And if you talk to 10 different Westerners about what Christianity is, they'll give you 11 different answers. So, and then they think, oh no, this is Christianity. It's like, it's part of it. It's part of the historic deposit of Christianity, but it's absolutely not the whole thing. So I want to do a series on that, because I think it's worth getting into. There's all these kind of continuation of this discussion, but I think we'll get to that when we get to that series. I'm going to do justice to these things. I'm not really putting it off, but I am putting it off because I want to give some time to this discussion. Reminds me of Rage Against the Machine, a favorite band of my youth. Not until I was a bit more mature did I realize the irony that they were becoming millionaires by raging against the machine. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in part 6. Exactly that, because the machine has this outlet for anti-machine rage. This is, I think, how Paul Kingsnorth talks about it, which is that if you have anti-machine rage, well, the machine will just monetize you. And then people will buy you. And then the consumer capitalist part of the machine just keeps on spinning, fueled by the anti-machine anger. Will you tie this up to the rise of AI cults? Yes. Yes. So I think I mentioned this last time. On Substack, y'all voted for technology in the occult. And when I was outlining it, I realized I can't fit it into 6 episodes. So these 6 episodes, this is the Dark Logos series. And we're talking about the framing, the historical, the Dark Logos, the machine. We're framing the moral part of the conversation. And then when we finish this in 2 weeks, again on Substack, then we're going to start the next part, the next 6 episodes. And we're going to do all of the modern issues, transhumanism, AI. We're actually going to do one on AI and one on the cults, like the Silicon Valley tech cults and all their like weird religious beliefs about AI. So we're going to get very into it, basically an episode and a half on that one. And we're going to do all of these modern issues and how do we think about them. But I realized that we couldn't just jump straight into those modern issues without this kind of broader historical paradigm for what we're talking about with the Dark Logos, with the machine. And of course, to do it right, you got to go all the way back to Eden and Babel and Enoch. So it's coming. It's coming. Hang tight. I'm sure you will enjoy it, because I don't want to cram too much into any of these things because I don't want to overwhelm people. And you know, it's worth slowing down a little bit. So I have a question about not this, but let's see. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire, Revelation 20:14. Yes. Why is death going to be judged? This is complicated. I don't know if we have time to get into all of it, but let's see, I have books everywhere. Yeah, it's over there. Religion of the Apostles by Father Stephen DeYoung, another ancient faith book. I don't get paid to plug this, but they're good books. He talks about how the devil and Satan and death and Lucifer are not necessarily all the same angelic being. It's really interesting. And he suggests that there's an angel of death whose job is to take the dead away, and that he doesn't fall until Christ becomes incarnate and saves men from death, and then he can't deal with it, and then he rebels. And he has an argument for why, this is a good suggestion. It's really interesting because when you read the Bible, there's all these equivocations or explanations, and you just kind of don't know why. Like Christ says, I see Satan falling from heaven. And you're like, but when did the fall of the devil happen? And Father DeYoung explains that there's some different falls of different angelic beings because they're all different. I think that's really interesting because you see, for example, like you see in Job where they have the divine council at the beginning of Job. You remember all the angels get together and Satan shows up too. He comes and they talk about what they're going to do about stuff. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? And it's like, I was just told, oh, that's the devil. And he just shows up because for some reason. But when you look at it again, you're kind of like, well, this is quite orderly. There's nothing in the Job account that gives you any indication that the Satan, which is a title, not a name, the adversary, is a fallen rebel angel who's been kicked out of heaven. There's nothing in Job that suggests that at all, actually. It kind of looks like he's part of an equal member of the angelic council, and he just wants to challenge people and test them. So he's like a tough guy angel. And then potentially that's the angel who falls when Christ becomes incarnate. Read Father DeYoung's book. It's a whole thing. So why am I saying all this? Because the death is going to be judged, because death might be one of the angels. It might actually be the angel of death who fell. I'm not sure. This is not my exact area of expertise. But Revelation is full of all these typologies that I think are not straightforward, that need to be read in a lot of context. Is your jurisdiction on the old calendar or new calendar? I am Antiochian Orthodox. We're on the new calendar. Blessed feast of the Synaxis of the Apostles. Thank you. Yes. Blessed feast, everyone, for all of us new calendarists. Peter and Paul was yesterday. It's a beautiful feast. Beautiful feast. Because death has been judging incorrectly. Yeah, I think it's something like that. Or he went in rebellion and fell because he couldn't handle the fact that Christ was going to redeem Adam from the dead, because his job as the angel of death is to take people to Hades. So this is speculative. This is speculative. There's not an orthodox, like so many things, this frustrates people. There's not like an orthodox, this is the orthodox dogma, like Catechism of the Catholic Church. Somebody says here saying judgment is more of a putting things in order than a courtroom thing. Yeah, that could be part of it. That could be part of it. Revelation, I'm weak on. I have a little bit of an allergy to it because I grew up around a lot of evangelical folks, and they were just so obsessed with Revelation and predicting the end times that I just was like, I'm not going to get into this. So I'm a little weak on Revelation, but that's because then you get into all these takes like, well, who's going to be saved, everybody, when, how, and that's a whole conversation. But I hope that's helpful, and I refer you to Father DeYoung, because his book was very good, and he's a great biblical scholar. Okay, I think we're good. I think that's it, and I'm really looking forward to. I'm just so looking forward to these two episodes that we're going to do on Substack next week and the next week for the machine, because revisiting this blew my mind. And the other thing I might do on Substack is the last thing I'll say, and then we'll go, is a lot of people have been talking about the Space Trilogy for a long time, and I've been talking about the Space Trilogy, and the Space Trilogy is great, and it has a lot of these themes in it. So I think that what we're going to do for the next few weeks, that we finish out this part of the series on Substack with the machine two-parter, is I'm going to do the Wednesday reflections as reflections on the Space Trilogy, because we didn't have time in the episodes to get to the Space Trilogy specifically, and I know a lot of you want to talk about it. So the weekly reflections for the next 2 or 3 weeks are just going to be on different Space Trilogy books and passages that I thought were really cool. They're probably going to be a little bit longer. They might be in the 20 to 30 minute range rather than the 10 to 15. So again, on Substack, you will enjoy, especially if you've been waiting to talk about Space Trilogy. Okay, thank you guys. It's been great. I hope you are enjoying the madness, and it's going to get darker the next couple of weeks before it gets better. We're going to have an episode at the very end of all of this talking about what do we do, because that's always the question that people want to know. I don't want to just sit here and fearmonger you. The machine's ruining everything and you're stuck in it forever. It's like, no, Christ has conquered it. You know that already. We are going to talk about, therefore, how we live in it. We'll get to it. Thanks for joining me, guys. This has been a listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio, and I will see you on the other side.